Joining me now off the coast of Alaska is Javid Sedney. He was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan, Pakistan and Central Asia. And now he's a board member of the Afghan Institute for Strategic Studies. Thanks so much for joining us, Javid. Now, first of all, I want to kick off by asking you, now you've been involved with Afghanistan for over 15 years. So give us some perspective about the US position on these talks. Why have they now held these direct talks with the Taliban?
Well, the United States has actually held direct talks with the Taliban before in 2010, 11, and also in 13 and 15. But those talks were almost all about the release of prisoners from the Taliban's perspective. The U.S. wanted them to transition to peace talks, but the Taliban were focused on the release of prisoners. Also during that time, the United States had a very difficult relationship with then Afghan President Karzai. He believed that those peace talks were a vehicle for the United States to sell out him and his people. The level of trust between the two governments was very low. Mm-hmm. Also, overlaying everything was President Obama's pledge to pull out of Afghanistan. And so the Taliban believed that if they waited out long enough, the U.S. would leave.
So you mentioned something very interesting, that the trust was very low then between them. How is the trust now? And you've described how we've more or less been here before. So what's different and how is the trust level now?
Well, there's one big reason, which is that the trust between the U.S. government and the U.S. administration and the Afghan government, both President Ghani and the chief executive officer, Dr. Abdullah, is much better than it was during the time of President Karzai. The two governments have worked through some very difficult times, and they still face hugely difficult issues in building a political settlement inside Afghanistan. But the trust is there, both at the top levels between President Trump and President Ghani, and at other levels such as Secretary of State Pompeo and ambassadors. Mm-hmm. So that relationship is much stronger. The second area is the United States has been putting pressure on Pakistan over the last 10 months or so. President Trump pushed Pakistan, took about $1 billion away in military aid, and that has made the situation on the ground a bit different. And then I have to add the final, and actually in some people's eyes the most important, is President Obama had a policy of timetables, setting a date, and then if that date was reached, nothing happened, he would pull out. President Trump has said that there is no timetable, that the U.S. is going to stay based on the conditions. And that has also helped change the perspective of the Taliban in Pakistan. Okay.
Now, I want to jump in and ask you, there's people that are missing here, the Afghan officials. Why are they not involved in these direct talks, being such big stakeholders in all of this?
The Taliban have made direct talks to the United States precondition for having any kind of talks since the beginning of the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, really, in 2002. The United States has been reluctant to have such talks, and they have had them, as I mentioned, a few times in the past. But the United States has wanted the Taliban to talk directly to the Afghan government, because in the end, any peaceful settlement has to rely on Afghans talking to each other. After the pullout of the Soviet Union in the 1980s, the Mujahideen refused to talk to the then government of Najibullah. So this refusal to talk to the sitting government has been a problem for Afghan peace negotiations for a long time. Okay. These talks today are meant to springboard into talks directly between the two Afghan sides. If that happens, peace is possible. If it doesn't happen, then I don't think the talks will be successful.
And what about Pakistan? It looks like it's going to have a new prime minister very soon, Imran Khan, and he's been adamant that Pakistan should never be involved in this war. So I don't know if he's changing his position now, but how do you think you would involve Pakistan then?
Well, Pakistan has always been involved, and Pakistan has played in many cases a double-edged game, both supporting peace talks and encouraging the Taliban to continue fighting. I'm not so sure if it's the election of Imran Khan that is the determinative factor, but over recent months, the United States and the Afghan authorities have been successful in killing several Pakistani Taliban leaders who fled to Afghanistan.
Okay.
That has been seen very positively by the Pakistani security establishment, and that may be one reason why Pakistan is more willing to have the talks go forward.
We've run out of time. I'm very sorry. David Sedney, thank you very much for your perspective and your analysis. Thank you. Well, now let's broaden out the discussion. And from Kandahar, I'm joined by Javid Faisal, and he's the former deputy spokesman for Afghanistan's chief executive. And in Madrid, we have writer Ahmed Rashid, who's authored several books on Afghanistan and the Taliban. And finally, Jeff Smith joins us from Washington, D.C., and he's a fellow at the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank. Thank you, all of you gentlemen, for joining us on The Newsmakers. Now, I want to open up the discussion and start, first of all, by asking you, Javid Faisal, what is the perspective of the Afghan government on these talks, since they're not even involved?
I believe this is a good start for the peace talks, because Taliban's only excuse for years was that they have to talk to the Americans. But mainly the current talks held between the Americans and the Taliban in Qatar are the talks for peace talks. But the actual peace talks will be with the Afghan government, and the Afghan people are hoping that Afghans should be talking to each other, not to the foreigners, because Taliban were side to the Afghan people, not the international community. Lately, their attacks have been killing Afghan civilians almost all the times. But at the end, there is hope, and the Afghan people and the Afghan government is willing to talk to the Taliban. But the American talks to the Taliban are seen as a good icebreaker for the peace talks.
Okay, a good icebreaker. I want to ask you, Ahmed Rashid, what is going through the Taliban's mind, do you think, at this time with these direct talks?
Well, very little is known about their internal status. If you remember at the last Eid, there was a 3-day ceasefire between the Taliban and the Afghan government forces. And it was an incredible moment, because actually the fighting did stop, or most of it did, and both sides adhered to the ceasefire. And one very important pointer that emerged was that clearly the Taliban are listening to their leadership, because all the Taliban groups, the commanders in the field, at some at great distance from where the leaders are, they all agreed to the ceasefire and implemented it. So that means that the Taliban are fairly united. Now, clearly on issues like peace and war and how to continue, there would have to be much greater consultation between the Taliban leaders, who are basically living in Pakistan, and the Taliban field commanders, and how the powers that be, Kabul, Washington, Islamabad, get over that hurdle is really what the next step is going to be all about. The Americans have been urging the Taliban in talks that they've had to get on with opening a dialogue with the President Ashraf Ghani's government. And clearly it's going to be the intra-Afghan talks that are really going to count. But I will say one thing, that I think it is very important that the Americans don't do this alone, because then it is likely to fail. I think what we've seen in past instances, the Bonn Accords, the Geneva Accords, it has always been outside mediation that has helped all the sides get together. And we probably need, not right now maybe, with the Americans talking to the Taliban, but when the Afghans start talking to the Taliban, I think some kind of outside mediation will be needed and required, just to make sure that the talks don't periodically collapse.
Mm-hmm. And where would that outside support come from?
Well, in the past, I mean, the two successful dialogues in Afghanistan, the withdrawal of the Soviet troops from Afghanistan, 1989, and the Bonn Accords after the American invasion of Afghanistan, 2001, 2002, they were carried out by the United Nations with the full support of the Americans, of the international community, and that is what is very important. I mean, no mediator, whether it's a country or an institution like the UN, can hope to succeed without full cooperation from all the players, and that includes the neighboring states, which are at odds with one another, and with Afghanistan. Russia, Iran, Pakistan have all been held responsible for backing the Taliban at one point, although they're also backing the government.
Okay.
So, you know, these countries will have to get their act together and agree to some kind of mediation.
Okay. Now, Jeff Smith, you've been patiently there listening to these comments. What are your expectations for these talks? Do you think Afghans have a chance of seeing real peace anytime soon?
Well, I think if anything, this is a hopeful sign. This is something that many sides have been hoping for now for years, and the main obstacle to direct talks between the U.S. and the Taliban in the past has been, frankly, resistance from the Afghan government. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, many in the U.S. also did not want to undermine the legitimacy of the Afghan government by engaging in direct talks with the Taliban, which is why I think it's an important and encouraging sign that officials from the Afghan government have signaled that they support this idea, that they support talks about talks. We're not negotiating a final settlement to the Afghan war. We're not negotiating key details about the Taliban's future political involvement in the government. We're sort of having talks about talks. And if that's what gets the ball rolling forward, and if the Afghan government supports that, then I think, you know, this is almost universally a positive thing.
Okay.
There's several very important questions that remain about where the Taliban stands in these negotiations. But I think the general sentiment here is that getting the ball moving forward on direct talks is a positive development.
But I just want to jump in there because Afghanistan had said do not have talks directly with the Taliban.
In the past, that has been the case. But when asked about the current negotiations, officials from the Afghan government have given positive signals that this is a welcome development. They do not want negotiations on a final settlement of the war. They do not want negotiations on the final settlement regarding the Taliban's future political involvement, but more basic negotiations, where they're even discussing prisoner exchanges that get us to those final talks, I think should be seen as a welcome development.
So talks about talks, that's okay?
It's a step forward. Okay. I mean, I think both sides recognize that we're at a bit of a battlefield stalemate, frankly.
Okay.
And some kind of political resolution will be required to end this conflict.
Okay, and before we heard from our first guest, Javid Sedney, who has over 15 years of experience in Afghanistan, and he said now there was much more trust between the US and the Taliban, and he said now, because the US is not putting pressure on Pakistan in the way it did before, and there was no timetable, that there was a different relationship there. So my question is, how do you work with Pakistan, which is such an important player? That question is to you, Jeff Smith.
In fact, pressure on Pakistan has been increasing under the Trump administration. So I would say that relationship is perhaps more frayed now than it has been in the past. To me, that's one of the big outstanding questions, is what is Pakistan's role in these negotiations? What's its current relationship with the Taliban? You know, we have to remember that a lot of reports and intelligence suggested the Pakistanis have scuttled attempts by the Taliban to reach out to the Afghan government, to reach out to the Americans in the past, that the Pakistanis wanted to have a seat at the table, that they wanted to be controlling the negotiations. And when certain Taliban leaders or factions signaled that they may be willing to have talks with the Americans or Afghans, the Pakistanis got involved and scuttled those talks. So there are several outstanding questions about the relationship between Pakistan and the Taliban, about Pakistan's willingness to have these talks move forward, or its willingness to play spoiler in this.
Okay.
And at a time where U.S.-Pakistan relations are arguably at the worst that they've been in many years.
Okay. I want to bring in Javid Faisal again. What kind of hope do you see for negotiations with the Taliban? And is this a new Taliban? Because we heard from Ahmed Rashid that the Taliban are listening, they're united. It seems like they've almost changed a bit.
I think there are hopes now because the latest ceasefire in the Eid that we had, it has raised hopes in Afghanistan that there will be some ways opening to the peace talks with the Taliban. But the main hurdle seems to be Pakistan yet, because Taliban in the past, we have seen gestures of Taliban coming to the peace talks, but those leaders, namely like Mullah Biradar, those guys were either detained or killed in Pakistan. So again, this time, there is hope for the peace talks, but there has to be pressure on Pakistan to make sure that they do not become as a hurdle in the peace talks.
And can you put pressure on Imran Khan, sorry to interrupt, on your potentially next new prime minister? How receptive will Imran Khan be to that?
Well, people aren't very optimistic about Imran Khan because he has always been a sympathizer of the Taliban. He has been a supporter for a long time of Taliban in their stances. He has been saying that publicly the Taliban's war in Afghanistan is a jihad. So if you look at his past and what he has said about Taliban in their fight in Afghanistan, there isn't much hope. But lately, after he was elected, we have heard some positive words coming out of his mouth. But again, the state policies, the policies that has been led by the army in Pakistan, those will be effective on the outcomes of the peace talks with the Taliban. Afghans are hoping much that the US will be pressuring more Pakistan to encourage Taliban or to allow Taliban to hold peace talks with the Afghan government. Again, the good peace talks will be between the Afghans. We have an example of such peace talks that had outcomes in the past. With Hizb Islami, with Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, we have had peace talks, and those were inter-Afghan dialogue, and we had the best outcome out of it. This time again, if there is any peace talks, it has to be with the Afghan government. But with the Americans, the current peace talks, that's a good icebreaker, and this will take away the only excuse of the Taliban that they want to talk to the Americans. But again, the main focus should be on Pakistan and what the Pakistan army and the intelligence service is doing. If they allow Taliban to talk, Taliban are willing to talk, they are Afghans, they will come to join their Afghan brothers for the future of Afghanistan. Okay,
and Ahmed Rashid, what do you really think that the US could deliver what the Taliban want?
Well, I mean, essentially what the US wants is an avenue which will open up between the Afghan government and the Taliban so that they can actually talk about real talks and real issues. The Americans are not going to do that for them. And the Taliban have to be told very decisively that you're not going to talk to us about the future constitution of Afghanistan or the future changes that are needed in Afghanistan or how to bring the war to an end. And one sticking point I do see in the near future is that the next move by the Taliban will be to say, well, show us some goodwill by withdrawing some of your troops from Afghanistan as quickly as possible. And that already there are very few American troops in Afghanistan. There are about 14,000 with about 3,000 to 4,000 NATO forces. And, you know, compare that to when President Obama was in office, he had 100,000 troops there. The Americans are not going to agree to that for the time being because the security situation is so vulnerable. And the American reply is likely to be, well, stop fighting and let's have a ceasefire which is a permanent ceasefire, and then we can talk about withdrawing troops. So the Taliban will want to drag out these talks with the Americans because they look good. The Taliban look like a powerful movement that has forced the superpower to its knees to talk to them, and that I don't think these American Taliban talks are going to end quickly.
Okay, and I just want to give, we have a minute left, the last word to Jeff Smith. There is an emerging threat now from Daesh. What does this do then to all this hope that we have, that we've been talking about that right now, the icebreaker, the obstacle going? You've got this big threat still here, the emerging threat of Daesh. How does this work with any potential peace talks?
Well, I think it in some ways creates further incentive for peace talks. I think when you have two parties that both have an interest in not seeing Daesh take control of Afghanistan, it provides yet another incentive for both the U.S. and the Taliban to reach some kind of settlement. And frankly, one of the key conditions and sort of red lines of the Taliban has historically over the years been no foreign military presence in Afghanistan, that this is a non-negotiable. And one of the, I think, more encouraging signs is we do seem to be getting some early tentative signals that there may be some flexibility on the Taliban's part in this regard. There's still obviously a big gap between the U.S. and the Taliban on this, but perhaps, you know, if an Afghan government with Taliban participation were to welcome the presence of an international security force, in part to keep Daesh and other foreign jihadist groups out, and in part to keep other neighboring powers from meddling in Afghanistan's affairs, there may be a set of conditions under which the Taliban could live with U.S. and other foreign troops in Afghanistan, which would satisfy one of America's core demands and help bridge one of the main gaps between the two sides.
Okay. Gentlemen, I'm afraid we've run out of time. I would have loved to have kept this going. Javid Faisal, Ahmed, Rashid and Jeff Smith, thank you all very much for speaking to us on The Newsmakers.